were there any who were mining claim owners?
We have a community called Irwin that's built in an old mining town that now has off-the-grid homes. We've reached out to them and had outreach with them, but never had them, I wouldn't say that they're regular stakeholders to our group. And the mining company that's U.S. Energy has been reached out to, but I think that there's I guess I would just call it assumption, for lack of a better word, that we're an adversarial group. And so we haven't had much luck having them come to the table.
So mining
You look like you're
owners
saying.
are not among your stakeholders.
I'm thinking, no, not in a real regular way. I wouldn't say that we have in that watershed a real significant number either, with the exception of Irwin, which are all being redeveloped as summer homes primarily. Most of that watershed is really limited. It's 70% Forest Service, I think.
Thank you.
Oh, we're done already.
One of the questions that I was hoping you all three would cover, and I think you did really well on that, but another question for Tony. You talked about, they're just getting ready, EPA is just getting ready to implement and start moving dirt in 2013. Is the impression from your community that that took a really long time, or are you pretty well satisfied with the timing of that?
Satisfied might be the wrong word. I think we're just cognizant more cognizant now of how long the federal process takes on these things. Certainly, we've seen, for example, the division just did a reclamation mining safety just did a project at Smith Hill, but that probably took 5 years to get going too, because there's the planning phases, and it's probably a little more expedited. It took 3 years of planning. Yeah.
3 years from the time we get the grant system
They're actually
project completed.
Yeah, so I think it's probably faster if it's being done, say, by our group in the future. We're also not taking on projects of that magnitude, and I would say even Tara's project doesn't involve flowing water, so it's probably a little easier to get at.
Now, EPA is looking at doing things with flowing water. And how long does that take?
Yeah, it's taken a while. I mean, what they were doing, this was happening concurrent, is that they had access to some emergency response money that allowed them to get at the waste rock and the waste rock and the tailings materials that were on site, and then concurrent to that, they were collecting the data to develop the remedial investigation and feasibility study, looking at all the toxicology stuff. So there's a lot of steps there that the EPA has to go through, I think, to kind of be able to justify the rationale for what their approaches would be in the future.
And your community's response to that is, you just got to put up with it?
Yeah, I don't think, we may be a little frustrated, but it's, I think, a very minor frustration. I think we're just cognizant of this is just how it's going to go. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's interesting in Anthony's response is that it's important to remember that no federal agency is able to commit more than 1 year of funding. They're totally dependent on annual appropriations from Congress, not from the president, from Congress. So you can make all kinds of plans, but Congress will not allow you to do more than 1 year at a time. There have been some funny ways you can accumulate a little bit to get a little bit longer term, but 98% of the federal budget is annual. That means real planning is very difficult, and it requires real patience on the part of the subject of the planning. It just won't work any other way. The other thing to remember is that anytime a federal agency wants to change something that it's doing, be a little more innovative, be a little more flexible, whatever else, that has to go through a huge process mandated by Congress. And if at any point in that process that mandate is not closely followed, that agency administrator will be in front of some congressional committee getting skewered, in front of the press for having failed his, responsibilities as a federal employee. So when you think about the feds, I am what I know, but when you think about the feds, remember that they operate, especially the EPA, I think they're the most subject to constant congressional scrutiny, which means they don't really want to do anything that they're not absolutely sure will really work, because it's really not fun being skewered by a bunch of congressmen.
I have a question for Zeke Ward. Zeke, is HECLA an active member of the Reclamation Committee since they're now active in the watershed?
Yes, they are, and Hecla was actually the first industry stakeholder to give their support to the Willow Creek Reclamation Committee, both with financially and sending people to the meetings, technical people, and their participation was very welcome. It took a little while to get some of the other mining interests involved, but we eventually got them as soon as we convinced them that we were this rabid environmental group trying to do something we shouldn't.
We did have a question that somebody wrote down who had to leave earlier. I'm going to read the question and we'll see who wants to respond to it. If one is already listed as a potential Superfund site and is already tainted with a negative public image, why not be designated as a Superfund site and tap into the resources available to clean up the environment and make one's public image positive? And if you folks want to respond to that?
Sure, contrary to what you said, there's a authorization process that's many years. They authorize a project. And there's an appropriation process that has to go on. But once you got EPA pregnant, their gestation period is not 1 year. And the benefit cost ratio goes up as you are working the project because you don't get any benefit until it's completed. So, the Corps of Engineers has made their living off of that little formula for a lot of years in the Civil Works program. And so I would say, hey, go ahead. Once you're designated, embrace it, get yourself into a 501c3, legitimate, and go for it.
I guess I would just speak to that for a second. But one of the concerns that we've had even in the Silverton watershed was a site that we're working on now as a watershed that would have qualified for Superfund listing. Would have met the minimum score to get on the national priorities list, but because of the lack of a human health risk threat, like we have on Coal Creek because of the drinking water supply, it would have been a really low scoring site, and it has to compete with all the other sites for funding in a given year. And so one of the issues there you should be very aware of, I don't think this is an issue locally because of the severity of the problem that I've been, I guess, learning about, is that if it's on the national priorities list, it stays there forever. And if we had put that on that list and EPA said, sorry, we can't get funding for it, so can't get funding for it, the work that we're doing now wouldn't be happening because we wouldn't be allowed to touch the site. It would be EPA only sort of thing. So just be cautious of that. Maybe in other communities.
More questions?
I got a question for Ed. You mentioned you don't do studies. You don't do studies, you said in your talk. And looking at small wind in Georgetown, for example, there's anemometer data that I think.
Oh yeah, we have,
necessary.
there's anemometer data, there's other stuff. But what I'm saying is, people want to do a project and they want to have a long study process. And they spend 3 times the amount of money doing the study process than it would take to just do it. And some of them are so simple, you can design, build over the end of your bulldozer.
For example, if there's more complex problem that you might want to avoid an unintended consequence. Say you want to move the tailings to an area that may not have acid neutralizing capacity, and then you might make a situation where you're releasing metals by moving dirt, and it's going to have a long-term effect. For example, anglesite forms by oxidation of galena, and there may be a pulse of lead that is unforeseen but may not be seen for several years after you move dirt. For example,
This hangs around the legal word site. What constitutes a site? The legal beagles originally said a site is a particular pile. But we said, hey, this is a site. The whole thing is a Superfund study site. And I can move stuff from Virginia Canyon up to the Gem tailing pond, which is high and dry, and make that a temporary storage, which has become pretty much permanent. And that was approved by Department of Health and everybody else, and it got the bad stuff that's hanging in the creek in Virginia Canyon out of Virginia Canyon up into a stable area, and can be then monitored at that state, in that stable state. So yeah, sometimes people put you in a box by some meaningless small word like site, and we skimmed that there. We didn't even.
Any further questions? One of the reasons for this session was to give people besides elected officials a chance to talk to folks from other watersheds that have had EPA's involvement. And so I think that there may be opportunity, if you folks are going to be staying around, to have other community members chat informally, or if somebody has a question for you all later, can townspeople find your contact information and learn from what you have been experiencing? Okay, let's run that perhaps through the conference organizers to send questions through, but we did want to make this as an opportunity for people to interact at the community member to community member level. So we certainly appreciate you folks coming to share your insights and information. Let's give these guys a big round